Good evening. Call to order the City of Cedar Falls Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for Wednesday, June 27th, 2018. Have the roll call, please.
Atkins? Here. Arnson?
Here.
Giarrusso?
Here.
Hartley?
Here.
Holst?
Here.
Leeper?
Here.
Oberly?
Here.
Saul?
Here.
Wingert?
Here.
Move on to approval of our minutes from our June 13th meeting. If there are no corrections or comments on those minutes, is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Is there a second? So motion and a second. All those in favor of approval of the minutes signify with aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Thank you. Our minutes are approved. At this point, we'll open the floor for any public comments. Seeing none, we'll move on to our next item on the agenda. We have two public hearings this evening. The first of these is a rezoning for the southwest corner of Highway 58 and West Ridgeway Avenue. And we'll go ahead and let staff do the introduction on that item first.
Thank you. So we would like to open the public hearing and begin initial discussion for a rezoning request at the southwest corner of Highway 58 and West Ridgeway Avenue. This would be rezoned from A1 Agricultural District to Highway 1, which is Highway Commercial District. It's approximately 50 acres in size, and the rezoning would allow for retail commercial development, which would consist of a large retail store along with several other smaller retail uses and several other potential future outlots for retail development. As you can see on the location map, the property right now is just, it's zoned A1 and it's just used for agricultural uses right now. If you look at the surrounding land uses, to the west it's zoned R4 and it's used for a mobile home park. To the east across Highway 58 is zoned Highway 1 already, and that's used for a recreational vehicle sales lot. And to the north there is a convenience store, a hotel, and then several residential uses. So rezoning this to Highway 1, there is similar zoning in the adjacent vicinity. So when looking at rezoning considerations, we look at several different criteria. Actually, I'll go through this first before I jump forward to that. So they submitted a concept plan. Again, they're looking at a large retail business with a storage yard, 3 additional storefronts totaling 55,000 square feet, a fuel center at the northeast corner of the property, and then several other potential outlots. They're showing 2 accesses from Ridgeway Avenue to the site. Both of those are from Ridgeway Avenue. There would be no other access from Highway 58 or Highway 20. There is an area of wetlands along the north side of the property. Those will not be disturbed other than just the 2 entrance drives to get to the site. And then also at the southeast corner of the property, you can see there's a large area there. It's approximately 11 or 12 acres of that property that they're showing a future interchange on. And so staff and the applicant has been in contact with the DOT. The DOT did a corridor study several years ago of the Highway 58 all the way up to Green Hill Road, and they're showing a potential new interchange at this intersection, of which the DOT has provided kind of what that layout would be. And so what the applicant has done is reserved that area at the southeast corner for potential future right-of-way for this interchange. So approximately 12 acres of this site will just be reserved in open space for that future interchange whenever that may occur. So again, going back to looking at some of the things that are analyzed when looking at a rezoning. One, is it consistent with the future land use map and the comprehensive plan? And what this slide shows is the future land use map for this area. You can see the area is highlighted in black there. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if it comes up that great on the screen, but I can discuss it. So it's the future land use map shows it as commercial corridor, and you can see basically all the properties along the south side of Ridgeway Avenue are shown as that commercial corridor area. Characteristics of this corridor include, auto-oriented retail service and office, commercial uses that serve the traveling public and citywide customers. So this is in harmony. Rezoning this to Highway 1 would be in harmony with the comprehensive plan and the future land use map as it designates it for such. Looking at the property, another thing that is analyzed is, are there proper services readily available to the site? So what I wanted to show on this slide is the location of sanitary sewer. There is a 12-inch sanitary sewer main. It's actually on this property itself, at the very north end of the property. That's the purple line there. There is a water main just on the north side of Ridgeway Avenue, which can be extended to serve this site as well. It's a 12-inch water main along Ridgeway Avenue. And then, so both of those services can be extended to the site. And then the other thing that we analyze is adequate roadway access. Again, I mentioned there would be no direct access from Highway 58 or Highway 20, but they are showing two accesses into this site. One where Nordic Drive meets Ridgeway Avenue, and then a little further to the west where there is a driveway for the two properties to the north. They would like to line up the access drive for this property with that driveway. So they are showing those two locations for accesses. The applicant is working through a traffic study right now, a traffic impact analysis, which will help determine if those accesses are adequate. And they will be presenting that to staff in the near future here. That should be coming forward before the site plan. So after the rezone, it would be a site plan for the actual development, and they hope to have that the traffic analysis done before the site plan comes in, so we can further analyze the access locations and whether the turning movements and everything are okay for those where they're showing those. So again, mentioned there's a wetland area, so you can see on the north side there's a creek, a dry run creek that runs through there with some trees. Again, they don't plan to disturb that other than just having the two entrances through there. So they will just mitigate those small areas there where they have to have the entrance drives. And then again, they're going to keep that area at the southeast corner open and reserved for future right-of-way. So at this time, staff would just like to gather any comments from the Planning Commission and any comments from the public, and then continue the hearing at the next meeting on July 11th. If there's any comments, the applicant can then address those when it comes back to the commission.
Just one bit of housekeeping before we proceed. We did have the notice of public hearing was published in the Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier on Wednesday, June 20th. So do you need a motion from the commission to file and receive that public hearing?
So moved.
Is there a second? All those in favor of receiving and filing the notice of public hearing signify with aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Thank you. So now we will proceed. Our order of presentation then will be to give the applicant an opportunity, if they are present and would like to speak to this item, then we'll open it up for public comment at that time. We will close the public comment for this session, give applicant a chance to respond to any questions or any of the public comments brought up, bring it to commission, and then as Mr. Graham has stated, this item will continue, the public hearing will continue onto our next Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. So at this point, I want to invite, if the applicant is here and present, would like to speak to this item, please come up and state your name and address.
Good evening. My name is Nicole Chimento. I'm a development manager at Midland Atlantic. Our address is 8044 Montgomery Road, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45236. Midland Atlantic developed the East Viking Plaza Shopping Center with Target and Shields about 10 years ago. So we've been part of the community for about the last 10 years. We're excited to have another opportunity to work with the community and with the Cedar Falls staff. So far, they've been excellent to work with and very, very responsive, so we appreciate that. We appreciate your consideration for the application for rezoning the property at Highway 58 and Ridgeway. I wanted to take an opportunity to introduce the team that will be working on the property. We have John Silverman, who is the managing director at Midland Atlantic. We have Dave Woodkey, who is the director of construction with Midland Atlantic, with us. We have Bob Garlock, who's the vice president with Bear Becker and the project engineer. Greg Cook, who's a project engineer also with Bear Becker, and Wardell Wilcox, who's a senior transportation manager with Bear Becker. This is the same team that worked on the East Viking Plaza redevelopment. Like I said, we've had a great opportunity to meet with staff. We've done that twice now. They've been very helpful, and we appreciate it and have had a great working relationship with them so far. You may have heard that we're trying to condense the process as quickly as possible. We will do everything that's expected of us and submit everything in a timely manner and be very responsive, but we did want to mention that we are trying to condense this as quickly as possible. So we don't want to be presumptuous at all in the rezoning, but we wanted to let you know that we will be submitting for site plan approval on July 9th. So you'll see us quite regularly over the next few months, and we're happy to answer any questions while we're here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At this point, we'll open up for any public comment on this item. Seeing none, and I'm guessing that the applicant doesn't have any further questions or comments. Bring it back to commission for discussion or questions of the applicant or of staff.
Just one really minor question. There's a little bit of mitigation on the wetland area. I'm just curious what the plan is for mitigating that.
Yep, please come on up again.
The plan would be to mitigate that through a wetlands bank credit.
Okay, so it's somewhere else they're going to get okay. I know it's not a very big area, but and I appreciate the fact that you're leaving most of that kind of as is. I think that's
It's less than a half acre. We anticipate it'll be about 0.33 acres.
okay. Yeah, it looks, I mean, I think that's a good way to just kind of leave that as is, so
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or discussion?
Yeah, I think I've got one thing. Is the timing of that traffic study and the next piece going to line up so you kind of can see the ins and outs? There's only two pieces there, and it's kind of close to the Highway 58 interchange. And, it's kind of a tight spot already. I don't know whether you'd be adding considerable things or if we need to consider that further with the traffic study.
Yes, we just met with them prior to the P&Z meeting, and they're within a week or two of getting the traffic report done.
Okay.
So it would be before the site plan comes to the commission.
Okay.
The site, like I said, they're planning on submitting July 9th, so that wouldn't come to the P&Z commission until the first meeting in August. So we should have the traffic impact analysis in and reviewed by staff and provide comments back to them by the time the site plan comes to the commission.
Okay, good.
I just have a comment or a question in regards to the land that's being set aside for potential limited access on 58. Now, would that mean that the four-way stoplight potentially in the future would go away, and this would be a limited access similar to what we're going to be seeing at Viking and 58 once the construction is done? Or is this too far in the future to be thinking about that?
Oh, are you talking about the Ridgeway and 58
Yes.
access right now with the new interchange?
Yes.
Oh,
That you mentioned several acres were being set aside.
yeah, it's hard to see on this plan. You can see it's way just at the very top right-hand corner. I think it would be an interchange, so there would be off-ramps to come down. Like I said, it's real hard to see. Thanks for zooming in on that. But you can see there would be an off-ramp to get off of there. So yeah, the stoplights may very well go away.
I think that's great to be planning in advance for that potential change in the highway.
Yeah, and from what we gathered with when we met with the DOT regarding this, it's not in their plan right now. It's not in their 5-year plan to do this interchange, but they did study it and at least laid a concept out. So when this happens, I guess we're not sure, as they didn't really give us a concrete date, but at least they have it kind of laid out as here's how this whole corridor could potentially look in the future.
Can you clarify, you're talking about the interchange for the 5820 or Ridgeway?
I think she was asking about Ridgeway, right? Ridgeway in 58?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think Highway 58 would go over, and then there would be off-ramps to Ridgeway. So it wouldn't just be a at-grade signalized intersection. I think, is that what you were asking, Deb?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Separate comment, but I'd ask the applicant to take a careful look at this is kind of at the front door of the community. A lot of people that are coming into, this is a first impression, so take that into account.
Well, then, Highway 1 is kind of what's been planned for this area, so I mean, pretty straightforward in that regards. But the Highway 1 does have, I mean, there's some aesthetic requirements in the setbacks and trees and signage and all that because of that a concern, I think. I mean, so that's why it seems like probably is the right zoning, it's the right zoning, I think, because they have to go through that whole process, right, Shane, with the site plan. There's a number of design elements we'll review at that point, right?
Correct. So yeah, the plan is to rezone it to Highway 1, which is site plan specific, and it's also within our Highway 20 corridor overlay district, which might have some added like open space, landscaping requirements. But those will all be things that the commission reviews during the site plan submittal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other discussion? Okay, with that, as we've noted, this item, public hearing will remain open on this item, and we will continue at the July 11th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. Move on to our next agenda item, a second public hearing. This is the rezoning and land use map amendment for 1015, 1021 West 22nd Street. The notice of public hearing for this item was published in the Waterloo Courier, Cedar Falls Courier on Wednesday, June 20th. And is there a motion from the commission to receive and file that notice of public hearing?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor signify with aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Thank you. That item is received and filed. With that, I would ask Ms. Howard to give us an introduction to this item.
I'd just like to note here that I'll be abstaining on this item tonight.
Okay, this is three different things for this particular case. The first two things are a land use map amendment to the comprehensive plan and a rezoning from R3 to C3. The property is located, the properties for these two questions, the land use map amendment and the rezoning, are at 1015 and 1021 West 22nd Street in the College Hill overlay neighborhood district. On the map, the location maps you see here, the properties under question are the properties to the west along 22nd Street. The two properties are under this particular item on the agenda. You can see this is an image of the future land use map. And right now, in the 2012 comprehensive plan effort, there was discussion about changes needed to the College Hill neighborhood. But that time, there was discussion about adopting an overlay district. This is in 1993. And since that time, at the time of 2012 comprehensive plan update, it was decided to keep the land use map boundaries similar to the existing zoning boundaries. So there wasn't a lot of discussion about how the commercial district should extend down 22nd Street or 23rd Street. So we have to look at a couple different things in the comprehensive plan to determine what the desire was for the neighborhood here. This map shows those two properties under question and the existing line of the future land use map that's designated as neighborhood commercial mixed use. This change would adjust that boundary to include the two properties that are the subject of this application. On the next slide here, this shows the 1993 concept plan in the College Hill neighborhood plan, which is was adopted as part of the city's comprehensive plan. So it is something that we look at when we're trying to decide whether this warrants a change to the land use map. In the College Hill neighborhood plan, it talks about a more cohesive and attractive commercial core surrounding a parking court. So as you can see here is College Street. There was discussion about trying to encourage additional commercial mixed use. Here's a commercial center extending down 22nd Street. And surface parking basically along 22nd Street. The subject properties we're talking about here fall about in this location. In 2012, in the update to the comprehensive plan, It states, extend the streetscape along 22nd Street to improve pedestrian access with wider brick sidewalks and parallel or angled on-street parking, or alternatively parking behind buildings, and spur local development of more mixed-use storefronts with apartment dwellings above. Bring mixed-use commercial development between 21st and 22nd Streets to link the Upper Hill and the Lower Hill along College Street into a more cohesive, walkable retail area. So I would note here that when staff looked at this and looked at the change between 1993 and the thinking in 2012, it seemed like there was a shift in thinking to that more urban, walkable, storefront commercial, rather than the older version of having a commercial core with a large surface parking area, more like a shopping center type development. So in the 2012 comprehensive plan for College Hill, there was a lot of discussion about creating more of that walkable urban pedestrian environments, improving the streetscape in the College Hill neighborhood to create that more cohesive feel to the mixed-use area in College Hill. This slide basically states just exactly what I just said, is the goal in 2012 is to create that more walkable neighborhood commercial area. So the proposal submitted by the applicant, as you recall, this case came before the commission and the council a number of months ago for a mixed-use building along College Street, a 5-story building, and there was a lot of concern about adequate parking. So this is a resubmittal of a similar proposal, but in this proposal it's to add some additional parking to address those concerns. So the applicant has proposed this new project to address the need for additional parking to serve the proposed mixed-use building on College Street and improve the streetscape on 22nd Street with a deeper setback so parking is buffered and screened from the public sidewalk. The parking lot will be set back 25 feet from the public sidewalk and is developed as a usable green space with some enhanced landscaping and benches and a planted screen wall, and also some additional bicycle parking and potentially some facilities for the bike share program, which is just getting started in Cedar Falls. And here's an image, a concept plan of what the applicant is proposing. And this is to address both the need for additional parking for the proposed mixed-use building on College Street, but also to address the concerns about, in the comprehensive plan, about enhancing the walkability of the neighborhood and not having unscreened parking lots along the streets, and to add to alternative transportation modes. So this is their proposal. You can see the screen wall, the parking lot hidden behind this usable green space, some public seating here, and some enhanced landscaping. So staff had some initial concerns about replacing active building uses on these two particular properties with surface parking lot. But after a considerable discussion, and we came to the conclusion that this was a reasonable balancing of comprehensive plan goals by adding the additional parking that's desired in the neighborhood, along with encouraging new mixed-use development. So those are potentially competing goals, but so we were trying to balance those two comprehensive plan goals. It should be noted there's enough space at the front of the lot with that setback to allow a future building in response to market demand as well. With the 25-foot setback, it would leave enough room for sort of a liner building, some sort of small commercial building, if there was enough demand in the neighborhood that would fill in then a gap that you wouldn't necessarily want to have with a surface parking lot. So this particular proposal would address that particular concern as well about having usable building space up against the street. So moving on to the rezoning request, which is in concert with then that comprehensive plan request. The existing zoning is currently R3, multiple unit residential. Now, the current zoning, looking at the requirements, is unlikely to achieve the comprehensive plan goals due to the larger front setbacks and limited residential densities. So in the comprehensive plan, it talks about walkable urban, extending and encouraging mixed-use development. This particular zoning district requires a significant building setback and is basically residential zoning. The proposed zoning, C3 commercial, is the city's urban commercial zoning district, and that zoning district is applied exclusively to downtown and College Hill. Allows mixed-use development with storefronts located close to the sidewalk with upper floor residential uses encouraged. So in the analysis of this request, one thing to consider is the consistency again with the comprehensive plan. Now, of course, they're requesting a change to the comprehensive plan, so if that is deemed to be an appropriate change to the land use map, then we would look at to see if this rezoning then is in concert with that change to the comprehensive plan. So some things to consider in the 2012 comprehensive plan. It talks about expansion of opportunities for urban mixed-use development, encouraging upper floor apartments that will provide new housing opportunities close to neighborhood services and UNI, potential to reduce development pressure on the surrounding lower scale neighborhoods, and opportunities for enhancement to the streetscape along 22nd Street. In the College Hill neighborhood plan, it calls for C1 zoning. However, when staff looked at this zone, it's fairly inconsistent with the more recently adopted 2012 comprehensive plan, which calls for the buildings closer to the street. The C1 zoning also has a significant front setback, so is an older commercial zone that's a little bit inconsistent with that walkable urban environment. And then the use of the property for parking to serve upper floor residential is also a consideration in the analysis here. And once again, it's that balancing of the comprehensive plan goals. With that, I just entertain any questions or yield the floor.
A couple questions. So in order for rezone this, there's two things that have to happen, right? First, we have to change the land use map, right? That's one item, and then you rezone it. So it's actually two things.
Right.
We go through that process to change it. Has there any been discussion or thought about, rather than just taking those two lots, C3 bumping out? I mean, I know we do that, but generally kind of like to zone things in a little more regular pieces. I mean, would it make sense to rezone everything from that C3 over to the next block, where the parking ramp is, because you got that R3 part that kind of comes up into the,
Right.
around the university, because that just seems like that's a more regular shaped zoning district, and to me, it would seem like that might be inappropriate.
We can certainly look at that. The boundary there, as you noted, to the south, there's the bookstore, and there's actually existing commercial
Right.
in that location and some surface parking. So
Right.
it would be something that would, make some sense to shift the boundary. To the north is a large apartment complex.
Well, I'm just wondering about because you're taking those two lots right on 22nd, but if you just extend that west to the next street and that whole,
Oh, cover the whole area?
yeah, because right now, you're just taking a notch out there. Doesn't make any sense to,
Saying take it to Myrner or something.
right.
And-
Yes, I'm sorry, Myrner, thank you.
A related question is the lot that is addressed 1009, is that going to stay R3, or is that also going to be, is that part of this plan?
The request was not, that's a different property owner, and they have not requested
Okay.
rezoning. That property is already
Sorry, C3 isn't
a
it?
zone C3.
It is, okay.
Yeah.
I looked at
Yeah, it's
the Blackhawk
residential
County
use,
residential
but it's
online,
zone
and it
3.
said it was R, so I wasn't sure about that.
So it's, as you can see here, that particular property is already in C3 zoning, and it's covered by the commercial designation on the land use map.
Thank you.
We could look at those questions about the comprehensive plan. I think that's a larger
I
question.
know that's,
and
I
then
know it's a lot different than probably their individual proposal, but I know I'm looking at it, it seems like, if we're, if you're going to really do something, that might be something to consider. But, that's a lot of different, I know there's a number of properties in there, and maybe that's another can of worms.
And
but-
whether the consideration is how far down 22nd and 23rd Street the commercial area should go, or whether there should be some other considerations for other types of.
It just seems like, to me, it just seems like to the south and to the west, basically that's the university property. You got like a 1 square block area or a little bit bigger in there that's kind of no man's land now anyways, and it would seem, but long-term potential to me, it would seem pretty reasonable that be C3, so that gives some room for the College Hill commercial to grow then too. But
Keep in mind, if it's C3, the parking requirements.
well, C3's got its requirements, so
Or
or
non-requirements,
non-required. Well,
They're different.
different requirements.
yeah, but I think that needs to be resolved. Probably some sort of resolution on that. But to me, that seems like that could be a nice area to develop and grow long term. So, I was looking at that as rezoning it. Generally, I was looking at it favorably, I guess.
Marty, your comments are about reducing spot zoning.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and it just,
I agree, I think spot zoning is doesn't make sense to me. If we're going to rezone, we should look at the whole thing.
It's really about the land use map, though, right? It's
Yeah.
not about
Yeah.
zoning necessarily.
So we have two things going on here, and Marty, you're talking about changing the land use, the future land use map.
yeah, that's my primary thing would be looking at that. Like, rather than just taking a little notch, that doesn't seem like that's very big picture thinking, which is what the land use map is supposed to be, so.
And then the second question is about the zoning, and the question of spot zoning. This wouldn't be considered a legal spot zone because it is directly adjacent to other C3 zoned property. So it would just be an extension of that particular zoning district to these two properties. I think those are valid questions. The question, and that's not the subject of this particular application. So if we were going to go that direction, we would need to renotice and have that larger discussion, make sure the public knows we're discussing those options.
If we're taking one little step, it seems like, well, let's really look at it.
Well, before we take that step, we'll continue with our presentation order, and at this point, invite if there's an applicant present, if you'd like to come and speak to the commission. Please state your name and address.
Absolutely. Dan Drendel, Slingshot Architecture, 305 East Court Avenue, Des Moines, Iowa. Representing the ownership group tonight. Maybe before I dive in a little bit, one thing that we kind of bumped into with considering taking C3 down further and further was as we get out of a residential core, the C3, if you want to bring residential down to the first floor, doesn't allow the same setbacks. And the walkability of extending the corridor, you'd really want to keep a pretty tight streetscape area. So I should put that in your mind as we started talking a little broader, that's something Karen and I started talking about. But I agree. I think, our effort here was really to kick off what was called for in the master, or in the comprehensive plan and in the College Hill overlay language. So this rezoning and what we'll talk about next in the project is really to try to balance that future growth with some of the requests to further buffer the parking need that might be present as part of the project. So I think we'll probably have a few more specifics in the next one, but that's the desire for this. I think, Brian, last time we were talking about, should there be a check valve
Yeah.
to talk about this? And I think City Council sent the message to go and find that. And so this property being allowed to have parking on it, while still addressing the streetscape ideas of the comprehensive plan, are really the goals in this rezoning and in this move here. And you'll see we got a diagram in the next one about, there's parking available for people directly on site that might be the people who would pay for a spot directly on site to be able to go to work every day. Then there might be somebody who uses their car less frequently that would have no problem being on a surface lot adjacent. And then if anybody was a student then that wanted to have a car to take a car home on the weekend, they could be in the student lot. So there's these different levels now that are applied, and I think that that's kind of the story of the check valve. Okay. The bike infrastructure that we're talking about here and putting in here is exciting because it helps link all of that together, along with hopefully a little bit more bike culture and even across campus and down to downtown and things, so that students can move around the city and move around the campus, not only on cars and foot, but also on bike. So we're excited to propose that as well. The C3 is just, I think Karen hit all of our big bullet points about leaving space in the front of the lot, not parking cars ahead of the adjacent residential parcels, because if it's a neighborhood in transition, those residential parcels still exist and those apartment buildings essentially are still there for the time being. So the cars don't protrude past that. So that's the idea. C3 will let some of those ideas get accomplished. I guess I would entertain any questions, and if it's okay with everybody, we'll hit maybe all the design aspects in the next portion. But the signage and kind of the plaza space is relating a bit to the building, so that there's a bit of a cadence and an experience to the street, and we intend to tell you a little bit more about that in the next one. So, any questions? Thanks.
At this point, we'd like to open it up for any public comments on this item. If you'd like to speak to this item, please come up to the microphone, state your name and address.
Ishan Vajpayee, 3831 Convair Lane, Cedar Falls, Iowa, here on behalf of myself and my client, Dr. Sires. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about the site plan when that comes up, but a couple things I wanted to peg on and maybe hear from staff in response on this issue is what I heard is that this wants to be rezoned to provide additional parking for not only the proposed building, but also future development, another building, and I'm going to get into this later, but there's not enough parking for the site plan. So you're going to toss another building in front of it and use this for the parking. You're going to have other people in the community use it when they come down to the hill, when there's not enough parking, as I'll get into later, for the building for which this is supposed to service. I think I also heard too that students maybe who live in that building can park in a student lot, and I guess I wasn't sure if that meant a UNI lot. So are we talking about reducing the requirement of parking for this particular site plan and sloughing that off onto UNI to accommodate that? Those are just some hypotheticals and questions I had in my mind when I was hearing those comments. And I think I also heard the phrase, the request for parking, additional parking. And as I talk about in the next part, it's not really a request. It's a code requirement. And those are some of my initial thoughts on this rezoning part of it. So thank you.
Hello, Excuse me. Thanks for allowing me to speak. My name's Dave Deibler. I live at 1616 Campus Street. Good gosh, I need a haircut. I owned and operated a couple businesses on College Street with my wife Barb for close to 30 years, and like I said, I live on College Hill. I'm here to express my support for this project. I'm overwhelmingly in favor of it. I like how it looks. I like what it aims to achieve, more density on College Hill. I do appreciate the process that's taking place here and to make sure that the parking's appropriate for the College Hill neighborhood. So I really appreciate the time you're putting into this. We had a visioning meeting earlier today with, I'm Vice President of the College Hill Partnership, I should mention that. We were walking up and down the hill today, and I think if you look back in the history of the hill, one thing was the streetscape project that the city of Cedar Falls did. Really opened up the door for what's happening right now, which has been tremendous. I think this project and more to come are key to the future of College Hill, of especially the retail zone, but also the entire neighborhood. So I'm here to say I urge you to make sure this is up to the parking makes sense, but I'm really in favor of it. So thank you.
Hey there. I'm Chris Martin. I live at 421 West Searly in the College Hill neighborhood, and I'm a member of, like Dave, the College Hill Partnership Board. The one thing I wanted to speak to, I'd agree with everything that David just said. I wanted to speak to the 2012 comprehensive plan. I was on the board as well during that time and worked a lot with the city on that plan. And so I think this project actually fits into our vision of helping to develop the hill, of helping to unite the upper and lower parts of the hill. I know there were some problems in terms of parking, and I understand the concerns of other landlords on the hill in terms of parity and the way the parking is applied, and I really appreciate the fact that P&Z has been looking at that. I haven't seen the final plan, but I understand at least it seems that might be resolved already. But I do want to speak in favor of this project. I think it's really, the development is really important, and the density that brings is really important as well. So thank you.
Anyone else like to speak to this item? Give our applicant a chance if there's any public comments or other questions the commission have, if you'd like to address anything that was said.
Sure, just in response to a couple of the comments. Again, it's going to be in the next presentation, but Karen will present where the parking on site is not required in this overlay district. This lot will be a private lot with assigned parking, so it's not a public parking lot. And then any future development, when we talk about leaving space for future development, it's an idea that we like because it's flexible and it doesn't lock in what the growth can be. But any future project would have to meet whatever project or whatever zoning guidelines are for parking at that time. So whether it would be on another site or an adjacent site or many solutions, but it would meet that.
Commission, other questions or discussion at this point?
So, I mean, I know the next item is kind of tied to this, but there still are separate items, right? So, I mean, we're looking at, this item is just rezoning of this property and the potential allowed use for this parking area, right? I mean, so it's not necessarily tied to the, to that project. It might be, but it might not, right? I mean, as I'm looking at it.
That's correct. If it's zone C3, then it's allowed to have any of the
Right.
uses allowed in C3 zoning, unless through a site plan there's something that ties the development of a
Right.
parking lot to an adjacent.
So kind of in that light, I mean, I look at it, I think that's, C3, it seems like a reasonable zoning for that property to me for the long term. And I don't, and kind of the proposed design and use, I think seems pretty nice and pretty reasonable, and I don't think it's incompatible or, with the C3 zoning, so, so I'm looking at it favorably for that piece of land. That's kind of how I view it at the moment.
Any other comments from other commissioners on?
I would agree that it seems a reasonable use for that land in the C3. So on standalone, I would agree. I would agree.
Well, looking at this, I believe that we talked about having alternative parking locations to enable this project anyway. That was one of the things that was brought up, 2 months ago, whatever it was. We saw that as a potential piece, and now here we have an opportunity to do it. And I think the project is great. I agree with comments here. I think it's a good opportunity for 22nd Street to kind of have a remake. If anybody's driven through that area, not that it's substandard or anything, but you can tell that it's a aging neighborhood with a lot of gravel. You drive through those areas, and I think that the parking lot behind these two properties in general is like almost all gravel. So it's not like we're losing a lot of green space and usable, walkable area. It's kind of a parking lot right now. So I guess I don't see that it's a good reuse of this property and enables a good development on College Hill itself. It's a nice project.
I would say I struggle a little bit with the C3 and making it C3, which would traditionally be more dense, and tearing down a building and building a parking lot. But at the same time, it seems like a good compromise based on where we are and the concerns of the community.
One thing once you rezone that to C3 though, you can come back and build a building on a parking lot. That's one thing too. It's like that's not that big a deal to tear up a parking lot, put a building if you're really intent on the building. Of course, all the other parking issues and things. Imagine that's all solved. Or not.
It's like a good compromise given our current zoning.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's any big advantage to the R3 there right now, just the way the area is developed around it. It's not, in my mind, necessarily a good R3 area, because you got so much commercial pressing in between the university and this, it's just, I just don't ever see it evolving that way in the R3. But.
Well, I guess it wouldn't be even necessary if the adjacent properties were open in that C3 district to put a parking lot in there. Mm-hmm. But that's not what the developer has available, and that doesn't work.
Seeing no other comment, as noted, we'll continue the public hearing on this item at our next Planning and Zoning meeting. That'll be on July 11th. We have no old business items, so we'll move on to new business. We have one new business item. This is the College Hill Neighborhood District Site Plan Review for 2119 College Street and 1015 and 1021 West 22nd Street. And again, the applicant is the CV Commercial LLC. And Ms. Howard, if you'd give us the background on this.
So once again, this is, of course, assuming that the other two previous items would be recommended for approval. This is a site plan then that ties the proposed new building that would front on College Street and a portion of it on 22nd Street to these two additional properties to provide additional parking. So that would be, those two would be tied together and become one site plan review. So staff reviewed that proposal, assuming that there's support for the previous two items. The proposal, of course, is a 5-story mixed-use building on property at 2119 College Street, 925 West 22nd Street, and 1003 West 22nd Street. The proposal has not changed much since the previous proposal a couple months ago, other than adding the additional parking on the two nearby lots. It's got 2 retail storefront spaces totaling about 10,765 square feet of usable storefront space, 83 residential rental units on the upper floors with 120 bedrooms total. Parking, 65 spaces on-site, additional 29 off-site spaces for a total of 94 spaces. This represents a parking ratio of approximately 1.1 space per unit and a 0.78 spaces per bedroom. So a little over 75% of the bedrooms in this project would be then parked. Here's a plan view of the entire site plan, both the proposed mixed-use building and the nearby parking area. You can see from this site plan the adjacency. There is just one property in between. The parking lot itself, access from that parking lot is about 100 feet from the residential entryway to the building. So with a mixed-use building, typically a mixed-use building is accepted as a ground floor devoted to commercial uses. The industry standard is basically that a mixed-use building has commercial on the ground floor, and then uses on the upper floors that have less need for that visibility and accessibility to the public. So typically those uses are residential uses located on the upper floors. For the upper floor residential then, that creates a buffer and a measure of privacy from the commercial activity at the street level. So that is what a typical mixed-use building usually comprises. The use is allowed, and then here's the question about principal versus secondary use that I know that you spent some time considering several months ago, so I don't want to go into detail, but I did want to provide this for the record. The College Hill Neighborhood Overlay Zoning District, the residential uses are considered secondary to commercial uses in a mixed-use building. A secondary residential uses located on the upper floors of principal permitted commercial uses are allowed. And the code interpretation is that when the main level of a mixed-use building has over 50% of its first floor area utilized for commercial purposes, the principal use of the property is considered commercial, with uses on the upper levels considered secondary. With this proposed project, approximately 62% of the ground level floor is designed as commercial space. So the determination is that the proposed project is a principal commercial use with secondary residential uses on the upper floors, which is allowed in the C3 zoning district. Moving on to other site plan requirements, the building setbacks. There are no setbacks required in the C3 district, but there are some minor setbacks provided around the mixed-use building. There is no density limit in no residential density limit in the C3 district. And with regard to parking, there's no parking requirement for commercial uses in the College Hill neighborhood. No parking requirement for secondary residential uses located on upper floors of a mixed-use building. However, the applicant is proposing 94 parking spaces to serve the residential apartments in the upper floors of this building. Now, this is the particular change from the previous application of 29 off-site parking spaces on the lots 1015 and 1021 West 22nd Street, which is approximately 100 feet from the residential entry to the proposed building. And here is the site plan view of the proposed parking area. It has 29 spaces, has 10-foot setbacks from the residential zone boundaries, both to the west and to the north. And there's a 5-foot required setback on the east side because even though it's a commercially zoned property to the east, it does have a residential use on it currently, so there is a 5-foot setback required for the parking lot. There's an approximate 25-foot front setback from 22nd Street. That's not required in the code, but that's what the applicant has proposed. There's one driveway and one pedestrian connection from that parking area to the public sidewalk and to the public street. The applicant is proposing green space amenities and bicycle facilities in that 25-foot setback, front setback. Landscaping requirements are met surrounding the parking area, screening requirements and tree requirements surrounding the property that would buffer that from neighboring uses. One note is that if this parking area is going to be tied to the other site, there'll need to be some sort of legal covenant with the deed recorded with this property. So that's something we'll keep in mind if this moves forward then as a recommendation. As far as open space, green space requirements, the C3 district does not have an open green space requirement, but the new proposed surface parking lot will provide approximately 3,300 square feet of open green space, which would include the extensive landscaping, concrete seating, benches along the public sidewalk, and a plaza area with the public bicycle parking and the facilities for the bike share program. And here's just a close-up again of the front area, the green space on the proposed site plan. With regard to landscaping, landscape screening is required surrounding any surface parking area. The landscaping requirement is met with the site plan. With regard to building design, in the College Hill Overlay District, there are some specific standards for building design. One of those considerations, of course, is height, and I think you discussed this considerably when it came through a few months ago. The building height requirement in the C3 district is 3 times the width of the fronting street, which is about 120 feet. This building is approximately 64 feet tall. In the College Hill Overlay, it calls for reviewing the scale in relation to adjoining properties and other nearby properties within the immediate neighborhood. And this is the exhibit provided by the applicant that shows the other buildings in the area that are taller and similarly scaled. It also shows the slope of the site sloping up toward the street section along College Street. So it gives some perspective of what the scale of the height of the building is. With regard to the proposed building materials, it is a combination of brick, metal, concrete, and of course the windows and doors. And you can see from the rendering here, they've tried to combine these, break up the building scale with these vertical modulations along the streetscape. They're using building material changes. They're using changes in the plane of the facade, also changes in the roof, the parapet heights. All those techniques are used to reduce the horizontal mass of the building. Staff has looked at this and feels that the articulation of modulation standards in the College Hill Overlay District are met. With regard to stormwater management, on the building site, stormwater will be collected on site via an underground detention, looks like a typo there, basin, and piped to the storm sewer along College Street. And for the off-site parking lot, there's pervious pavers that will allow infiltration down through the parking lot into an underground basin there, and then that stormwater will drain through the pervious pavers to the storm sewer along 22nd Street. The engineering staff, city's engineering staff, is reviewing the final designs and calculations and does anticipate completion of that review by the next P&Z meeting on July 11th. I note that in the staff report it said, I think July 25th, but that was a typo, and they should have that analysis completed by the next P&Z meeting. With regard to other requirements, the trash dumpster is located within the parking level of the building. Lighting, there's no specific requirements in the code. They're proposing lighting at the exterior entries and architectural uplighting of the building facade. And of course, the parking area will be lit to be safe, and the lighting will be shielded and fully downcast. With regard to signage, they're showing some signage on the building renderings, but of course, any detailed sign plans would have to be submitted to the city for a sign permit. There's a requirement for a minimum 5-foot paved sidewalks. Those sidewalks are already in existence in College Hill, but anything that was torn up or removed, they would have to replace. They're showing some additional decorative paving located near the entrances along 22nd Street, and of course, the additional streetscaping that they're proposing with the parking lot. So with that, the Community Development Department recommends gathering additional comments from the Planning and Zoning Commission and public relating to this request, and to continue the public hearing at the July 11th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting.
Thank you. We'll invite the applicant again to speak to this portion of the...
You can note that I'll abstain on this project as well.
Thank you.
Dan Drendel, Slingshot Architecture, 305 Court Avenue, Des Moines. So I think building on what we talked about before, we were really talking about use and extending the streetscape down the 22nd Street, building towards the comprehensive plan and the goals set out there. I think with the two proposals, it's kind of good to divide into, what are the specific strategies implemented here. Karen did a great summary. We've worked together on doing that. I think the big point is that this, coupled with the parking lot, the goal is really to try to address that transition of a neighborhood that's set out in the comprehensive plan, how to start that, and how to make it flexible enough to go through being the first of its kind on the street, and then how to be flexible to the future. So Marty made a great point too about really a parking lot is also very flexible to future development, and parking locations can shift as long as they still meet all zoning. But our strategy was also to think about leaving enough land in the front of that parking lot to either build an infill kind of development if there was more land available, or and to exist well in the neighborhood as proposed today. So to create a pedestrian gathering space at that point, a lawn space that can be used, a bike share program, but also to connect well to our development. So some of the architectural features, the seating wall and the signage that's shown in there is kind of a perforated metal panel. Those elements are seen again on the building at the entry sequence, and the balcony fronts are the same perforated metal. It's really the same panel. So the brand kind of carries through. You can see in the site plan that the entry point to that bike share program and the entry point to our building are kind of opposed angles in plan, whereas you're going to walk through this pedestrian space down the sidewalk, that you see those in reference to each other, and you know that they're dialoguing together, and that they're a story of new development and of new pedestrian space. Kind of the side note here is that there's a lot of parking really that's fronting 22nd there. And so while we're proposing to put in that same use, we want to tell a story that's signaling to the future and that future development. So we're excited to do that. We feel that this is a good balance of those goals and a good working both relationship and process with city staff and all of you. I would hope that as we've met here several times that you guys feel like the comments that we've heard have really been integrated into what we're doing, and that we're really trying to balance the needs of many ideas and people that are constituents here. So the other thing just to hit again is that those proposed uses of parking where you have covered parking that's under the building, that's a level of parking that probably has an extra rental to it, and then that there's surface parking and there's adjacent surface parking, and then really we anticipate most of our building residents being students, so student parking is a great asset for them too. This is a great place to add density and not have such high level of parking requirement. I think that's what the zoning code currently sets out to do with this overlay district. So that's what we're doing. I know sometimes our discussions have helped to have some context to them. So like in Des Moines, when we're in our central business district, similar kind of zonings, we don't have a parking requirement at all. So parking demand is really driven by the development team and what they require. our development team here felt that with a student population, really 33% or a third of the beds would have met the demand that would have filled into this development. But here we're, through this process, we're up to 78%. That's fine. I mean, that's actually kind of in line with what our downtown developers do, not students, in Des Moines. So just as a point of reference. And then the 100-foot distance to the front door is another thing that we see sometimes in some of these downtown overlay districts. So as we work in a community in Wisconsin, they have a distance that they require for off-site parking that's 300 feet. So, and that's actually really property line to property line, not necessarily access points. So, you know, this development, even aside from the goals of our developer and our development team, and this community being part of a student community, really is also meets kind of the benchmarks and the standards that we see in other downtown areas. So I think there's a lot of assurance we can take in that it is a good check valve as we talk about that, that it has a lot of things going for it. So if there are any questions for me on the building, if you guys want to see building materials again next time we meet, I could, or I'll be prepared to, I guess. And then we have Sam Kessel from Bolton & Menk who's doing our landscape design, and I wanted to have him come and talk about the streetscape and the landscape that we're doing on this property. Thanks.
Thanks. My name's Sam Kessel with Bolton & Menk. I'm landscape architect for the project. We're at 309 East 5th Street, Des Moines, Iowa, Suite 202. You know, Dan has done a great job explaining it. You know, we interface 22nd Street as well as College Street. I want to bring up the point that at College Street, we're acknowledging the design character that's already there. We're not proposing changes to the design, so this will fit right into the existing streetscape along College Street. And then on 22nd Street, we're continuing that sidewalk. We're adding the street trees along there, making the improvements there, but also really focusing on the pedestrian connections. Dan mentioned earlier the materials used for the pavements in front of the entry zones. It'll connect the pedestrian plaza with the main entry to the building, helping connect the two properties, even though they're disconnected slightly. As we look at the parking lots, it's a big consideration of ours always to pay attention to headlights on cars. I know that's always the biggest issue here when we put a surface parking lot and with residential surrounding it. So we've taken extra care here to be sure that all headlights from direction of cars are covered. You know, we're not going to be shining headlights into bedroom windows and stuff on these parking lots. The green space design, looking at the green space design here, although it's not required, we felt it was very important to add based on the lifestyle of who we're attracting to the areas. We feel it would be a great asset bringing the bike plaza in. We've got areas we can have bikes parked. We've got areas that we can have the bike share program, as well as just open green space that has some benches to allow people to just kind of congregate, talk, you know, play on their smartphones and stuff. So with that, I guess I can leave it up to questions.
I'd like to open it up for any public comment on this item.
Ishan Vajpayee, 3831 Conver Lane, Cedar Falls, Iowa. Here as a citizen and on behalf of my client, Ryan Sires. I'm an attorney at Balkirk and Holman Waterloo. I'm wearing two hats, citizen of Cedar Falls, 33-year-old guy, native of Cedar Falls. And I heard a lot of things about Des Moines and what they do and how cool the project might be, and I don't disagree with any of that. If we want our code to allow this project, the code needs to change to meet the project, or the code needs to change to allow the project. You don't get to say a mixed-use building, commercial ground floor dictates the principal use of the building because it's the industry standard, or this is how we do it in Des Moines. There's the City of Cedar Falls standard. It's called the code, also known as the law. It's my job as an attorney to point out the deficiencies this project has with the law. And the easiest way to do that is the way any court would do that. Look at the plain language of the code ordinances. Whether or not this building can comply with the code depends on whether it's deemed a principal residential or whether the residential is deemed secondary to the commercial use on the first floor. As I'm going to go through, and you didn't get my document in time, so it might be a little bit more lengthy, but I'll try and be curt. The only way this building works is to warp the plain meanings of the word principal and secondary and make 4 stories of residential stacked on top of 1 floor of commercial called primary commercial. In the presentation, it's true. Secondary residential on top of primary commercial is allowed. That is allowed by the code. The code allows and states that then there's no parking requirement. But the real question is whether it is a secondary use, the residential portion, or whether it's the primary use. And this is the controversy because, as we know, a principal residential building in this overlay district would be subject to the off-site parking requirements of the College Hill overlay district and the R4 zoning district, which are actually the same. And it's going to be subject to the density requirements, which the city report admits it doesn't meet lot size. So which one is it? Is it principal residential or principal commercial? Well, look at the code. The code section for definitions in the zoning states that the principal use is the main use of the land or the structure. And in my experience, courts will say, well, what's main mean? What's main mean? Main is defined by Webster's dictionary as chief in size or importance. Nowhere in the code does it say that the principal use of the building can be determined solely based on the first floor. That may be the staff interpretation. That's fine. But staff doesn't write the code, and staff has their own interpretation, and I'm going to get into what that's based on and why I think that's faulty too. So what's the main use of the building proposed? What is the chief use of the building? Well, and there's some discrepancy, I think, between the site plans and what was put forth in the slides, but this is from the site plan. It's 66,752 square foot of residential stacked on top of 11,603 square foot of commercial. That's 5.75 times more residential than commercial space. What's the use of the project? What's the chief in size or importance? What's the biggest use of this building? Precedent has been cited to justify allowing any amount of residential on top of a primary commercial floor and calling it primary commercial. Buildings, the only precedent that forms that basis, or examples that form the basis of that quote-unquote precedent, are buildings that needed that special treatment because they couldn't meet the parking requirements. They're urban flats, 2 above 1, and I think it's a well-litigated issue that there's a parking problem with urban flats. It's Domino's, 1 above 1. It's Sidecar, 1 above 1. River Place Development is not in the College Hill Overlay District, and 200 West First Street is not in the College Hill Overlay District, and I know there's a lot of controversy with that one too. So, if you accept the premise that a building with 5.75 times more residential in it than the commercial in it is a primary residential use, then it's subject to the off-street parking requirements. And let's talk about what those are. As I discussed earlier, it's been sort of posited that this is a negotiation. There wasn't enough parking the last time, let's add some more parking, should be good enough. It's not a negotiation. It's a requirement of the code. And the code requires this math. And if the code shouldn't require this math, then the city council needs to change it. Not planning and zoning, or the Board of Adjustment needs to grant a variance. This is the real math. 194 spaces with the parking, with the visitor parking added in, and instead of framing it as 78% of beds having a spot, I don't know what the other 22% of people are supposed to do in January, February, December, when the bike share program is a little tough to get to Hy-Vee. It's actually 48% of the required parking by law. And it's not even all on-site parking. I already talked about the density requirement not being met. That's admitted. It only isn't an issue if you think 1 is bigger than 4 or 11,000 is bigger than 66,000 or 60,000. I briefly want to address the character of the neighborhood issues and mostly start a dialogue on this because this is the more subjective part of this. I can't claim that the code says exactly one thing or exactly another on this part of it. But as I outlined in my letter, I commissioned a review of the site plan by Dirk Westerkamp, a registered architect from Studio 129 and Company in Des Moines, Iowa. And I asked him to look at the elevations of this building and talk about whether the scale between Dancer and Bartlett or the St. Pete's or the church building, whether that really is visually accurate. And what he, to the eye, because that's the character of the neighborhood, to the eye. When you take into account the ground elevation upon which this building sets, it's not necessarily really just 63 feet. It adds a little bit to it. And what does that mean? At least in one registered architect's opinion, this is the real scale. Pink is the proposal, and these are the adjacent buildings. It's pretty big. Scaled against a photograph of Great Wall in the Shakery, that's the size. It towers. Now, again, this is more of a subjective issue. I don't claim to have the absolute answer on it. This is more brought up as food for thought. The walkability concept that this building is being proposed on the premise of walkability of this town, it's like building a house on top of a basement where there's no basement. There's no foundation for it. Cedar Falls isn't a walkable town. It'd be really cool if it was. But when 22% of kids who live in this building don't have a parking spot, where are they going to park? How are they going to get to Hy-Vee to get their groceries? How are they going to get to this new retail plaza being built out on the highway? Not on a bike. Not in February. Make Cedar Falls more walkable, then build this building. Or chop a floor off the building and have a few. That's one thing that I haven't heard. Why not make the building smaller? Why don't make the building meet the law? Not come up with some idea that 60,000 square feet is less than 10, and then say the law doesn't apply. This thing is short by over 100 parking spots. Where are those 100 cars going to go? On the front of 22nd Street, on the street, in the parking lot that abuts Razor's Edge, on the down the street that abuts Domino's and the Olive Street building, which has a little bit of a parking problem too. Those are questions I think need to be seriously considered when thinking about the wisdom of setting aside the law to allow this building, as opposed to just changing the law through the proper procedures or seeking a variance. Thank you, and I'll clean up my mess here.
Thank you, Mr. Bajpai. Is there anyone else who would like to speak to the item? I want to invite our applicant if there's anything that was questions or comments that were brought up that you would like to address at this point.
I think the only thing worth taking on is that the staff has determined that this does meet the zoning code through the overlay district. You want to follow up on that, or should I read it? I mean, we bring this up every time, but the secondary and accessory residential use is actually clarified in the overlay district, and so that takes precedent over, or takes supersedes even the general statement, which I know is kind of a broad statement about what principal and secondary use means. But in the overlay district, it says that the secondary use established on the upper floors are allowed as long as that the residential use is not on the first floor. And then it goes so far as to say, Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council review related to the establishment of secondary and accessory residential use shall not be required unless the property owner proposes utilizing any portion of the ground floor area for residential instead of commercial. So anyway, it's worth pointing out, but that shouldn't be ignored in a conversation like that. So appreciate it.
Thank you. Commission discussion or questions for staff?
You know, I like the project. You know, I think the added parking looks nice and done a nice job, but and I don't have a problem with the height. I know that's subjective, as that was mentioned. You know, like there's a lot of good things. The only thing I'm still stuck and won't change, I guess, because I think parking is required. You know, I think how the zoning has been interpreted is not correct, and I agree with parties who say, you know, right now our code says there's got to be parking for this. So we either need to change that zoning on the citywide level. I don't see making an exception for a project. That opens up a huge can of worms. You know, it needs to be addressed at the big level. Right now, this is still short parking by any measure we have in the city, right? And it's not equitable to me to have this project have a different standard than everything else that we've done in the city until we can either change the citywide requirements and then it falls into that. That would be great. But I just, you know, have too much heartburn that we're doing something that can't stand behind, you know, from an ordinance standpoint. So love to see this project happen, but that still looks like a hurdle to me.
So I have a question. I understand what the C3 is, and I also understand the R4. Tell me about the overlay again, because Dan is trying to say that the overlay supersedes the requirement for parking.
Staff can go through that more closely and parse the terms at the next meeting and get that up on the screen so we can look at it carefully. But basically, there's additional language in the overlay to address a mixed-use building. And generally, when you have language in a zoning ordinance, any interpretation, the zoning shouldn't be interpreted such that it renders language meaningless. So if that language was to mean something in the college overlay different than was intended to be something separate and different and specific to the College Hill overlay, otherwise it wouldn't have been added to the code. So I think there's some presumption of validity to the added language. So then we need to look at the added language to see, because it's generally the rule is the more specific to the situation would apply. Because this is an overlay, the standards apply to the overlay in addition to the regular zoning in the city. So in those cases, then the more specific regulations apply to a particular case. So that's just kind of some general zoning rules about zoning. But we can bring back at the next meeting something more specific to look at that language again if the commission, a majority of the commission would like us to do that.
So I have another question. I see that there's a space in here for a new building. And we were talking about the 100 feet from the parking lot to the entrance or to the building. If there is a need for more parking, why do we leave that separate? Why isn't that not used for parking?
I think the question here was, what does the comprehensive plan say for the future of this area? What's the goal and the vision for College Hill? And if that goal and vision is consistent with the 2012 update to the comprehensive plan, which calls for that walkable urban, mixed-use buildings close to the sidewalk, that's what they're trying to balance those goals. We've got the goal for, of course, the people desire to have some additional parking. That became clear at the last go around with this application. So that's trying to address both the parking need and also to address the standards and the vision of the comprehensive plan in the future. So a surface parking lot close to the street with not much buffer is not very consistent with what the future vision is for College Hill, at least according to the adopted comprehensive plan.
So what we have here is a conflict between our code requirements and our goal and vision.
Well,
and we haven't done anything to work that out, really.
Just to be clear, the interpretation is that there's no parking required for this. This would be additional parking that's provided, but not required. And in addition, while there's parking lot standards for minimum setbacks to parking, there is no standard for maximum. So it's not like this parking lot does not meet the standards. It's providing a setback, a maximum setback that's different than, so.
All right, thank you.
I'm in between a little bit on this one because I feel like this does meet the long-term goals for this area very clearly, to make a more walkable area. Technically, it meets the secondary use definition of residential as you describe it. I think it's not too much of a stretch to believe that originally applied to projects that were different than this one in terms of a Main Street kind of, residential over commercial, right? Maybe 1 or 2 stories. So it seems like technically it does meet those requirements, but I would agree with Marty that some clarification would be appropriate to clarify this different kind of condition that we're proposing here. From my opinion, it is different than what we've seen before, and maybe the intent of the code at that time. I support the project. It's a good project. It's the right thing to do. We need to clean some things up.
So to clarify, you're supportive of Marty's request and what I heard Karen say in terms of additional information and what the overlay requirements add to this? I'm getting lost a bit in terms of where we're asking for further clarification.
Technically, I'm convinced that, yes, it meets the letter of the code and it meets our goals. So for me, that's enough to move the project forward. I do believe that in the long term, we need to clarify some things. So we're not doing this for every project that comes down the road.
Yeah, because I'm saying, I guess I'm a little bit in the opposite. I don't see that it does meet the code totally, and that's my problem. I don't think the code clearly supports this, and if it did, I'd be fine, with the project. But I don't think it does. I think it's out of sync with what the code is actually requiring.
I agree with Marty. I don't see that that it supports the code either at this point. Although I love the project. We started that process, right, of looking at the parking requirements with across the whole city, and I think that's a good thing because I'm not saying the parking requirements we have are absolute and are the best thing for us, but run into a problem anytime we do something for one project and it's not fully supported by the code. It opens up a huge can of worms, and I'd rather see us address this on a citywide basis and come up with what the code's going to be it's really clear for everybody, and then see how the projects fit in there. But I'm not comfortable that the project meets the code as it stands right now, and so I can't support it just on that basis. Like I said, I like the project. I think it's pretty cool, and I think it would be fine on College Hill, but one project by itself can cause a lot of problems for future projects when there's discrepancies, within what we're approving. Not to mention lawsuits and all kinds of things like that. So I'm just not comfortable that we're there.
I think this was kind of on the premise, though, that we don't have a one person, everybody gets a car number. I think that's the thing that we've got to try reconcile. That's really where we're at with C3, since you don't really have to have things. We're depending that this number that we've gone through and tried to develop of 0.73 or whatever it was cars per apartment, if that's the right number, then you've got enough. And I think that's what we were talking about before. If it isn't the number, what is it?
Right.
And then it goes back to, is it back to R4? So somewhere along the line, where's the real deal at? Okay. So best number.
I think that's where we're at, is we're talking about, well, what gets closer to what we feel meets the current code. We're completely in the gray area.
Yeah.
No.
And I think it's probably been a studied number. I don't think you guys didn't pull it out of your, I think that's the number. You've done some research and followed this in other communities and understand where it's going. Okay.
The numbers are clear depending on how you interpret secondary use.
Right.
So it's not really about that. That's an issue.
Yeah.
But what is the interpretation of secondary use? And it seems pretty clear to me what you're saying, but again, my take is that's pretty old, I would assume. And is it intended for this? It's enough for me because I like the project and I think it's the right thing to do to meet the long-term goals.
Other commissioners we haven't heard from?
I would agree with Marty and Leanne, the concern about how we define the code. And does parking need to be based on more of a residential versus commercial?
So obviously, we have one legal opinion, and maybe we're looking for another. Is that a fair statement?
Could you repeat your statement? I'm sorry.
Well, we've heard one legal opinion tonight, which is great. And is there another way that it can be presented a similar way at the next time from a code perspective that we think is, or the city thinks is the way it's supposed to go? Because obviously you've given the developer an indication that it fits and works. So what would be the legal point to bring back to, discuss from the other opinion? Because I'm wrestling with that right now. I don't know what to think.
The city attorney's reviewed this, correct?
Right, this is the city staff position that it meets the code.
Yeah, yeah. So.
So we've heard some conversation about the ratio, parking to bedroom. Are there, the other way to address this would be, are there changes to the project that would make it closer, make it fit for the commission?
Technically, we've approved the project once with less parking.
I was going to say, there is a kind of a wrestle between a C3 district is to promote density. Any high-density district in the country you go to has a slight parking logistic issue. It's hard to satisfy both of those if you want high density and then enough parking, because if you have enough parking, then you create box stores with parking lots. So I guess there's got to be a compromise to try to get the two to meet, to create the high density.
Well, I think when the C3's, the basic concept behind it is, there's no parking requirement when it's commercial because you're trying to encourage commercial, but the C3 was, I think at one point, there was a question whether the residential was even allowed in the C3. Going way back, when we first approved some downtown upper story ones, there was some questions about that. But I think that the C3 is intended to really, the commercial, try to let as much commercial density as you can get in that space, but the residential really looked at as a secondary use. We got lots of residential throughout the community, and it's always hard. The things we have the hardest problem with are commercial space. Commercial land. Everybody objects to everything about the commercial space every time it comes up. So, C3 was, as I always understood it, it's really trying to get that compact commercial space.
True, and then when you get to a mixed use, what's the equation that determines the adequate parking?
Right.
What's that number?
Yeah, what's that number?
Yep.
Like I said, I think it's kind of hard to push high density and have enough parking.
Yeah, there probably, should be a separate parking requirement for that type of thing, but, the way our code is now really doesn't really have that.
I guess I'm confused. I'm for the project. I think it's a great project, but I see the contradiction of trying to 100% park a mixed-use facility like that.
Yeah.
Okay, any other direction for the applicant, for staff?
Do we have a summary of what we're asking for yet? Hillary started there. Do you have another list? Maybe we kind of know what we're asking for.
So from what I understand, what you would like at the next meeting is some more careful consideration of what the language in the code says in the College Hill overlay, and how it addresses parking differently than the standard parking requirements throughout the city, and how staff has arrived at the interpretation that it meets the code requirements. And then I don't know if you want any kind of analysis about these questions about parking. There's a difference between parking demand, of course, and what the actual parking demand is, and what code requirements are. But that seems to be a broader question and perhaps not specific to what you're being asked to approve with this case. So I guess I'm asking the question of exactly, we can come back and provide any kind of analysis you would like us to do at the next meeting that would help clarify things.
Well, so I have a basic question. So we approve the project, and we know that there are 120 bedrooms, right? And we know that we're only going to park 94. There's only parking available for 94. So where are the rest of them going to park if they bring a car, which probably is going to happen? May not, but let's say they do. Where then do those people park? And I guess that's the question that the people adjacent to this project have. That's the question they have. Is there enough parking in that area to support possibly the people that don't have a place to park? And if there's not, what happens? They start using parking lots that they're not supposed to, or, that's typically what happens. And I guess I'd like to know UNI's parking ratio number. I understand Iowa City is different than Cedar Falls. Cedar Falls, everybody goes home on the weekends. They don't fly in here to go to UNI typically. People drive here to UNI, and I think that's what we've heard from other landlords. Their apartments are 98% of their people park cars. So if that's true, what is the real number for Cedar Falls? I understand that there may be a national number, maybe even a regional, but what is Cedar Falls' number? What is UNI's parking number? That's what I'd be interested in hearing.
And I would add to that if the assumption is that some of the tenants would use parking at UNI, that they would get a UNI parking permit to verify the UNI parking regulations, because I know, for example, you can't park in a B lot all night. And are there limitations on what permits students can purchase if they're not living?
And we do know some of those regulations. We certainly can go through those at the next meeting. And also the city's parking policies with regard to there's quite a bit of public parking, of course, in the area, and and what the usage of those parking lots are, how many permits are purchased on an average monthly basis, and we can provide that information if you would like us to do that.
Okay, I guess my last question, I know we haven't really talked about scaling the project. Maybe we could understand what the project would look like to make it fit the requirements. If the code says it's got to be parked 100% with the project, what would the project look like? And would it still be something that would be brought to the table? If it really is sawing off one floor and it takes out the rooms and the parking problem goes away and it's still a good project, okay. But if it goes away because of that request, then that's another thing we'd have to deal with.
And I would say that's probably a question for the applicant to address.
Yeah. Okay. So if we can understand what that ramification may be.
How is this project different in terms of development of the projects that this commission has approved downtown on Main Street?
How is it different?
Is it?
On which property?
On State Street.
State Street? Was it?
Or on Second,
Was that 100% parked? I think it was.
Yeah,
or all of them?
yeah.
Yeah, you got the underground
Revolving.
parking and the lots.
We've held them, all of those projects to that standard.
But is that a different overlay code? That's what I'm asking.
Yes,
If-
it's a different overlay.
So, Mr. Drendel, I think that what the commission is asking is for the applicant, for you all to come back to us with some other options of, you know, what happens if we reduce the scale of the building, the beds. I think we need to see what that looks like. I will say that's consistent with, commission has asked that of other applicants and other projects in the past.
Seems like a way to avoid the impasse. Maybe.
And do you have any other questions for us? This needs to be as productive as possible so that we can.
Sounds great. Only just there's kind of a request for a legal counterpoint to this. Last time we did that, we had a counterpoint letter, we had our attorney here, laid out the case, staff and their attorney agrees. Do you want that person back to have an in-person? I mean, again, to be productive, I don't want to.
Honestly, if we can't read the code and understand it, we shouldn't be commissioners, so I guess I just need to go back and look at the code, the overlay code, and look at it.
I mean, some of those questions we're focusing, right? Like, what's the difference between your C3 districts? It's the overlays. This language is not in your downtown overlay district. The parking, we did go through that last time and verify with the school that people can park there, and that the other property on 23rd is doing that practice of having people park there. One thing, just you guys like to think broadly, the operations of those lots right there don't actually function as kicking people out for overnight parking. So that might just be something to talk about, or as a recommendation, because people aren't getting towed if they stay overnight in those lots. So if you want to drive people into functioning the right way, it's kind of the only way. There's also not metered. It doesn't turn over. It's not forced to turn over in the adjacent lots. So that could. You're talking about adding density to this neighborhood and trying to make it work right. That just might be a recommendation to look at. But anyway, to stick to the project and to ask you guys questions, let me know what you want to do about the legal. I appreciate your comment, Leanne. But if we want to have them here, I want to have them here. I don't want to cause another meeting because you want to hear from somebody.
If we can't, so we
We'll
do need to.
We'll have we'll have the developer here next time, I believe. He just had a personal thing tonight, so can speak to what happens to the pro forma, essentially, is what your question is really rooted in. And does the project go, or does it go away? I'll let him speak to that. I believe it's on the unfortunate end of that category.
The real deal. Yep.
So we do, this is a new, the items before with the land use change and the rezoning, that is a whole new public hearing. This is a whole new item before the commission, so we need to treat it that way. But I'm going to ask for staff's guidance, because we have gone through a lot of these questions previously. And if there's a way to be efficient about sharing that information with the commission again in a timely way.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, we have another meeting that we can bring some of that information. Of course, I wasn't here, and I'd take advice from others that were here and all that was discussed. I think we were kind of assuming that those questions had been sort of discussed and considered at the last time, but certainly it's always open. As you say, it's a new application, and we need
Want to get them a part of the
consider it
public record on
carefully, and
this discussion. Yeah.
So we're happy to bring those questions back and provide a legal opinion. And if you need one from the applicant, I would suggest that it's up to them whether you want to bring.
The letter's definitely just a piece of paper that we can include, but let actually the lawyer being here. Right.
I think if we can have a conversation with staff just about what
Okay.
what is really necessary and what gets the correct information to the commission without any extra burden, unnecessary discussion or burden on you all. Try to do that.
Okay.
Okay. With that, I would look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Those in favor of adjournment signify with aye.
Yeah.
Aye.
Opposed, nay? Thank you. You're adjourned.